Hey, good morning to the US, good afternoon to Europe, and good evening to our friends from Asia. Thank you for joining today's webinar on how to redesign global API supply. I'm Patrick Wolf, partner at Tenthpin Management Consultants, and it's my pleasure to continue this free life sciences webinar series. We did the first one a couple of weeks ago on life sciences with the topic of supply chain resilience. Today we'll continue with the second one on API supply. We're conducting those webcasts to actually share our insights into current events and best practices in life sciences. I'm excited to have very renowned speakers with me today. I will introduce them very soon. But before doing so, I just want to do some quick housekeeping items. As most of you join other webinars and also ours, you're used to it. So because of the size of the attendees, the number of attendees, we said that we put all attendees, you all on mute for the course of this webinar. But of course, you have the opportunity to raise questions, and this is very much welcomed throughout all presentations. So please use the control panel on your left-hand side by using the chat function. So raise your questions already during the presentations. We will collect them, and at the end of the webinar, we'll have a 20 minutes panel discussion with the experts so that we can read them aloud, and we will answer as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. So today's session is very exciting because we experience on a daily basis how interdependent we are with our global markets and the supply chains in between. In particular, the last weeks during the COVID-19 crisis, we realized that there was a lot of politics-driven discussion around whether onshoring of API production from China back to Europe or US or PPE production is of relevance. So let me give you an overview of today's session. The agenda for today is we start with, of course, with the first presentation of Bin, and later on we have a presentation of David, followed by a panel discussion at the end of this webinar. Wrap up from myself and also some highlighting some key takeaways for all of you. First of all, I have to do the advertising part, of course, to present Tenthpin. So Tenthpin is a global consultancy, very much focused on life sciences industry. So for life science industry, we do the entire end-to-end consulting portfolio. So from strategic advisory, a lot of business process re-engineering, and of course, IT implementation work. So our ambition is to become #1 in life science for supply chain, and in particular, all ERP transformation work. So the entire service portfolio to deliver to our services to pharma companies. So slide should give you an overview of the services we provide to our customers. So as I said, if I start from business consulting side, there's a lot of strategic advisory around new operating models, redesign of operating models, data analytics. What we also provide to our customers is, of course, in life science, very relevant merger and acquisitions consulting. And of course, also the IT side on the right-hand side, technology consulting, covering mostly SAP implementation work, but also beyond digital innovations, we consult for our services for our clients. Okay. Just to give you a brief overview and really an extract of companies, we did a very successful project in the sector of life sciences, focusing on supply chain management, just a couple of well-known logos out of life science industry where we did successful projects in the past. Okay. We are happy to have also a lot of people today joining from Asia this webinar. So therefore, I want to focus also and highlight our practice we have in China, covering life science companies also and doing consulting services in Asia, in particular in China. So this is just again an extract of very successful client project we did in the last years, covering again from strategic advisory, business consulting work, and also IT implementation work, and including also very innovative solutions around CTSM or big data, data analytics. Okay. So I'm very excited to have very special speakers today with me. Let me start with Bin Sheng first. So he's an advisor of the SDIC fund in China. So I'm very happy to have you in that webinar, Bin, because that's we have firsthand experiences from the ground. Bin is located in Beijing in China, and he is and now this I have to read out because that's a long term, Bin, for your role. So you're doing consulting services, you're a senior advisor of the State Development and Investment Corporation and China's National Social Security Fund. And Bin will share the latest insights of the results of China's National People Congress, which took place only a couple of days ago, which you might have heard on the news. So welcome, Bin. I'm really looking forward to your presentation. Our second speaker is Professor Dr. David Francas. David, I know him quite a long time. Now he's a professor. The last 5 years, he's a professor for logistics, supply chain management, information systems in Heilbronn in Germany. And I'm very happy to have you also as a speaker, because you just recently published a paper titled Overview and an Analysis of the Possible Effects of Coronavirus on Drug Supply, a long title for your study. We're excited to hear about your findings in a couple of minutes.
Thank you.
So let's get started with the first presentation. I would like to ask Bin to share or give an overview first of the latest news and current situation in China. In particular, also reflecting the results of the National People's Congress, which just finished end of May with 2 sessions. And to all of you, all attendees, please remember, raise your questions by using the control panel and the chat function. So hand over to you, Bin, and the virtual stage is yours.
So thank you very much, Patrick. It's an honor to be invited to do this presentation to share my thoughts, with the audience and also with Professor David. And my name is Bin Sheng. I'm a partner of Succeed Consulting company, which is based in Switzerland. And we are dedicated to promote the industrial collaboration between Switzerland and China. We're helping Swiss companies to find market access to China. And also, we're helping the Chinese company to find the innovation, from Switzerland or let's say Europe. I'm also an advisor of SDIC fund, which is one of the largest, state fund in China, and which is, focused on investing in life science, IoT, electric, vehicle, and manufacturing. So in the past, 2 or 3 years, SDIC fund, was most, active, investors in life science. So annual investment size to this industry is around $700 million. So it's quite large. So we invested, the innovative, drug companies, the medtech or biotechs, and also, some, clinical trial, service, companies. So API production obviously is a major business in China, and it's estimated China will export, 30% of its, total production, to the world. So I want to give you, some, figure data, about, how dependency, the rest of the world, rely on not only China but also, India, which are 2 biggest they are players in the API industry. So according to the European Fine Chemical Group, estimate that 80% of the chemical in Europe, it's from China and India. And according to FDA estimation, so 72% of the API, from the rest of the world, and China, including 18% from India and 13%, from China. So for the manufacturing size to the U.S. market by region, so you can see, only 28% of the manufacturing size in the local America. So which means, the significant, shares of, the share of, manufacturing size, from the rest of the world. So then, we can. That reminds me of President Trump wants to bring back the manufacturing size to US for employment, for the independency. I mean, is it possible? So we're gonna argue this point later. So for the manufacturing facilities for the regulated drug products from the WHO, China has a significant number. It's a accounts for 13%. US is 28%. For the WHO essential medicines to the US market, China has even more dependent, the world, or let's say Europe and the US, rely on China and India. So why this phenomenon, will happen in the world? I think the globalization, it's a main drive, cost, the cost down, for the farmer business. So is it good or is it bad? We can argue it, but always there is a big driving force, behind the API supply. And so I just found the wheat index from the WHO. If for the Western country, the average wheat index is 100. For China, is 8%, and India is 10%. So to my surprise, the China is even cheaper than the Indian company. And for the lower, I think the international farmer companies, long benefit, from the cheap labor, lower electricity, coal, water, and logistics, and the fewer environmental compliance. So the diversification, I think in the short term, diversification is happening, but for the long term, it's really difficult to redesign, the supply chain of the API. For the national security reason, because there is always a trade-off, between the secured or the benefit from the lower cost. So if the US or Europeans said, oh well, with 20% to 30%, it's produced locally, but the major shares rely on the rest of the world. So then you can diversify. You can produce by yourself, but only problem is the cost. And for the how to lower the cost, I believe in the long term. So there must be the innovation for the advanced manufacturing to produce to replace the cheap labors, to lower the cost, to lower the energy consuming, to increase the margin of the drugs. So I believe in the long term, the advanced manufacturing technology will replace these main elements from India and China. And also diversification, because of the politics, because of the mentality. So the Western country probably diversified to allied countries, like India. To my surprise, I found India just have an initiative to establish the science park. They are gonna invest billions of dollars to produce the API in India. So actually, it's not only the Western countries, but also India is heavily relied on Chinese APIs suppliers. And also supply, the supply is driven by the market demand as well. For the two gigantic countries in Asia, India and China, we internally, domestically, we consume a lot of medicine. So that's why we definitely will be big supplier for the ingredients. And the healthcare system, as I know, in China, basically the social healthcare system can cover 80% of the expenses in the hospital. And for the rest of the expenses, you can either cover by yourself or by the commercial insurance. So that's gonna increase the demand of the consumption of drugs. And the market also attract a lot of foreign farms to produce to register their product in China. Of course, for those product, they like to produce the ingredients in the same region. And the registered drugs from the overseas can be treated as a domestic drugs. That's gonna you can go to the once your product from overseas register as a domestic one, then you can go to the social health care system to be covered by the social insurance. So Patrick just mentioned the two sessions. For the last two presentation, I'm gonna introduce the future challenge to China. So before the 1949, before the new China was established by our founder Chairman Mao, and there were the three great mountains. Probably a lot of people from China, they know this. So one is the feudalism, and two is the imperialism, and the last one is capitalism. So which three mountains weighted on the backs of Chinese people for more than a century, 100 years. It's a long time. So I think after the winning, we claim the winning of the war, and Chinese people gained the great confidence. We thought we get rid of the imperialism, and we are independent. And for the feudalism, probably a lot of people know the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So Cultural Revolution basically it's disrupted a lot of things. So even the Chinese beautiful the history or the heritage it's destroyed a lot of things in China. But there are still some good things. In China you can see a lot of regions. We rebuilt a lot of the buildings or the great buildings, and they just tear off all the old house and build high scrap the apartment to solve people's the living problem. So that's by I think caused by the Cultural Revolution. And for the capitalism, in the 1980s, China opened to the world, but we we didn't call it it's a capitalism, but actually it's called a socialism with Chinese characteristics. So it's basically, if you are doing business in China, I think we are more capitalism, but we didn't call it capitalism. So the new three big mountain or new three great mountains in front of China is one is the virus in the pandemic. Try to contain the pandemic. It's the first important mission for this government. And the second is how to recover the economy, because the 70 million people have been out of job. So social stability is the first important thing for China. So how to maintain, and in one city is called Chengdu. The governor is quite smart. They encourage the 100,000 people to do the street vendor business. So just during a night, 100,000 people just had a job. So that's a great, great achievement. And even the Premier Li Keqiang, talk about it, after the 2 sessions. So it's very simple, but people can get a job, right away. And for the last, the great mountain is how to manage the diplomatic crisis. Because in China, if you don't use VPN to see the outside, you feel nothing. But if you see the outside, if you have foreign connection, so you will feel it's really, really challenging for the government how to recover the normal diplomatic relation with especially with the US and the Western countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Yeah. So during the 2 sessions, because I believe everybody know. So this year, this session, Premier Li Keqiang didn't announce the GDP target, because we gave a GDP target since 1994, but it's the first time we don't mention the GDP target. So why? Because the employment is it's a crucial thing. And also, we focus on the alleviating the poverty. So where is the engine for the world economy if China don't have set up, the GDP target? So that's a question, And second is, we use, the physical, measurement, physical to boost the budget deficit. So the central bank just issued special bonds, 2.6 trillion RMB to increase the liquidity in the market to help the local government to cover their debts and to help the small medium-sized company to recover. And also during the 2 sessions, I think the Premier Li used one paragraph to emphasize and the global cooperation to defeat the virus. So that's a significant a signal to the outside. China will take responsibility to maintain the supply chain, including APIs. So that's my interpretation, about the 2 sessions. Back to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Ben, for this very marvelous insights about the outcome of the National People's Congress, which took place only a few days ago. So now, as we learned what is happening in China and this massive investment program you just explained, and how to conquer the three mountains, I'd like to understand, what does it mean for global drug supply, serving, or China serving the drug supply to be produced in Europe or US as major market, as we just seen in your slides, the beginning slides as well, been. So I'd like to hand over to you, David, to understand what is the dependency of the global drug production on API supply coming from China, and what does it mean for future production?
Okay, thank you, Patrick, for the very kind introduction. So I'm very happy to be invited to share our thoughts on global API production as well as supply chain resilience. So I'm professor in Puranas, Vellus, director of the Healthcare Supply Chain Institute, a think tank and consultancy focusing on life science in particular. So if you're interested in our research, I have some references here below on the slide. They're available online, but I'm also happy to send them to you if you drop me a note. And I would like to start with just some quick remarks on what we have just seen. So basically, we've seen both India and China play a very prominent role in global API supply. That's a fact confirmed by both data from the FDA, the American agencies, as well as the European agencies. There's just one little remark here that's quite important. So if you take a look into Indian newspapers, you will see there's some quite ongoing discussion, because also India as a major API supplier is heavily depending on China, because many Indian manufacturers need both API as well as starting materials, raw materials for API production from China, a fact that is, in our opinion, further highlighting the key role China plays today when it comes to global drug production. So on the next slide, I would like to share you some insights into how drug production is typically organized. So I'm using data here from the American FDA. So what you see on the map is API as well as manufacturing production site registered to the FDA, so sites that supply the American market, the US market. So the red pies indicate manufacturing, especially bulk production, for example, primary packaging, while the blue bars, or the blue pies, indicate API manufacturing sites. And we see two interesting things here. So first, if you take a look at the very large red pie around the US, we see that manufacturing tends to be a quite local thing. So manufacturing sites that supply the US market are typically located in the US market. So 60% of the manufacturing sites that supply the US are actually located in the US, while only 20% of the API manufacturing sites are actually located in the US. And here we see the pattern we have discussed before. China, India play a very prominent role, but also several European countries and Japan, and of course the US, are important API producers for the American market. And what we feel based on our interviews in industry is that China, India, especially strong when it comes to API supply for generic drugs, while the other countries, European countries such as UK, Germany, Italy, Spain, and France, Japan and US are particularly strong when it comes to supply for patented drugs. So on the next slide, I would like to share some insights on how API production is actually set up in the Chinese market. We use again data from the FDA. So it could, oh, here it is. And you see a map here with a lot of blue dots. Each of the blue dots is representing an API site registered to the FDA, supplying the US market. And if you look at the distribution of those blue dots, we see a pattern which is quite familiar from other industries. So most of the production is actually located along the coastline. If you take a look at the three red circle provinces, Shandong, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, they account for more than 50% of the sites. If you would start counting the dots, Those are around about 300 registered sites. And we also see here marked in red the Hubei province with the city of Wuhan, where, let's say, the corona outbreak maybe started. And this province is the 6th largest in terms of registered sites, and that explains why we had, after the shutdowns in Hubei and Wuhan, immediate fears of potential drug shortages worldwide, actually. And in order to better understand the underlying dynamics, we switch industry just for a moment and we take a look into the automotive industry. An industry, as you probably all know, that was severely hit by shortages due to the corona outbreak. And I would like to highlight, explain a little bit the underlying dynamics we found. So you see here on the vertical axis the inventory levels, just as a remark here. At assembly plant level, they range typically between 15 and 30 days, so much shorter than in pharmaceutical industries typically. And we see the timeline. And basically, our analysis starts with the Chinese New Year, which started in January 25. And we typically see that companies order before the holidays in China, make sure that the supply leaves China before the holidays just to ensure steady supply. And then, as we all probably remember, right after or during the holidays, let's say the corona crisis became evident. Those holidays were first extended, and then we saw shutdowns all over China and later worldwide. And you see here the blue line, actually inventory levels then went down in China, in the US as well as in Europe. If we assume that the Chinese manufacturing plant stopped manufacturing prior to the holidays, the last shipments arrived then mid to end of February, so inventories went up, but then supply chains in the automotive industry began to starve globally. Basically, same story for the US as well for Europe. And then pretty much in line with our projections, we saw shutdowns due to shortages all over the place, basically almost at the same time, both when it came to the European manufacturers, as well as with regard to American manufacturers, simply due to shortages. And that brings us to a very important question regarding the pharmaceutical industry. Why didn't we see similar shortages, fortunately, of course, in the global life science industry? We feel that's an important question also for the panel discussion, so please feel free to share your thoughts. We feel it's the length of the supply chain. It is in particular the inventory level. So inventory in pharma supply chains is at least on average 3 times higher than in the automotive industry. We also have, of course, a different ethical obligation here. And that brings us to an important conclusion when we talk about supply chain resilience. If we want to evaluate supply chain resilience, we need to take into account supply chain resilience defined as the capability to withstand, in particular, high impact disruptions. We need to take into account the whole structure of the supply chain, including capacities and inventories. And that was basically motivation of a research project we initiated in 2018, so actually long before the corona outbreak. And in this research project, we look at ways to leverage analytics to better measure supply chain resilience, as well as to optimize resilient supply chain design. And in this methodology, we are a little different from standard risk methods. So we don't want to estimate the impact of an event or to estimate probabilities, which is in practice often a very difficult thing, but we want to develop an approach that's mainly based on supply chain data that is actually available in ERP systems and planning systems. We use this data to construct a model, a digital twin of the supply chain planning environment, and then we leverage optimization algorithms to evaluate, to optimize patterns. We can do this at a quite high level of details. In this case, We modeled the supply chain, for example, at plant location level, at SKU level, allowing us to evaluate supply chain resilience, optimize, for example, risk inventory, also to conduct what-if analysis. And I'm going to share you just 2 slides on how this could look in practice, based on a case from a biotech supply chain. So in this case, we modeled the end-to-end supply chain from API to secondary packaging to the markets, including also the key suppliers for packaging material, excipients, vials, for example. And we use here a different metric, which is time to shortage. So as we all know, quantifying the impact of a disruption, the probability is a very difficult thing. Probably no one had made an estimate for the corona outbreak in December, even if there were some early signs. This metric is basically based on available supply chain data and just asking how long can a certain node in the network, could be a plant, could be a CMO, or how long could the supply chain actually continue providing drugs if a certain node, such as a plant or CMO, fails, without specifying the actual reason or the actual probabilities here. And what we see is, which is quite logical, secondary packaging depends on the inventory levels in the markets and the disease. But then it becomes more surprising if you take a look at suppliers. So some of suppliers are less risky, while others are more critical. And that's basically confirming one observation during the corona outbreak, that also packaging materials, excipients became critical supply for drug supply chains. We also see that the dedicated sites, bulk as well as primary packaging, are quite critical, while in this supply chain, API is less critical due to high inventories as well as due to a dual sourcing concept. So both API sites protect each other for failure. That's one thing. Another thing I would like to share is another benefit of using such a digital twin is we can also go into financial evaluations using the data we have regarding prices and so on of our SKUs. In this case, we look at the major disruptions of both API sites fail, and we look first at the financial impact, so the sales at risk. We also get an indication for the markets that are probably exposed to disruptions first. And that's another benefit of using such a digital twin. We can also go into details and see at market level, at SKU level, which SKUs are probably subject to a shortage, what are the sales at risk. We could also look into service levels, for example. That brings me to the conclusion of my part. Some learnings from end-to-end risk modeling and the resilient design for pharmaceutical supply chains. We feel that it's important to consider multiple scenarios at the same time, not focusing on just a single risk scenario when developing risk mitigation strategies. We also see there are some rules of thumb. It's often beneficial to position risk inventory close to the market as a buffer against multiple scenarios, close to API production, because there is low flexibility in many cases. We also see it's very important to consider capacity, dual sourcing inventories at the same time, because they are substitutes. If you have low capacity flexibility, you will likely need more risk inventory, for example. We have seen, especially when it comes to biotech, that shelf life constraints play an important role, and you cannot rise inventory to infinity, especially when it comes to biotech supply chains. And last but not least, we shouldn't forget the non-drug nodes, because also excipients, packaging material can limit the overall drug supply. And that would be the end of my part, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion.
Thanks a lot, David. I very much like the insights, and the good conclusion is that so far we haven't faced any shortages of drug supply. No stockouts, fortunately. So not comparable to toilet paper or pasta we faced the last weeks. So that's a good thing. But bear in mind still, I'd like the last no, not the last slide, the one before, but what is the financial or could be the financial impact of disruptions, and how many markets were impacted in your simulation or digital twin you have just shown. So that can be massive. Okay, so thanks to the two presenters, and I'd like to open the panel discussion, as you just mentioned, David. Let me check the first question we received. Okay. So what makes producing APIs in China so efficient? So I guess that's a question for you, Bin, to answer.
Well, I think, as I said, I think more than 20 years ago, China joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And from then, China, start to produce, a lot of fine things. Not only, the consumable goods in the supermarket or shopping malls, but also, they move to produce, for example, drugs, APIs. So after decades, they're already established, the ecosystem in the regions, as Professor said, in Hebei, Zhejiang, or Jiangsu, the ecosystem is very efficient and very effective. So plus, the labor cost is still much cheaper, and for the environment, compliance is still loosened, and take advantage of the low cost of energy. Then gradually, the globalization, make the supply chain, move from the traditional Western countries, to China and even India.
Okay. How would you judge in comparison, the European or US manufacturing capabilities? How effective would you rate them in comparison to what we just heard from China? Maybe a question to you, David.
I think it's a matter of prices, honestly. So I think what we have seen before is, for some supply chains, especially when it comes to patented drugs, we see more often that API sources are located in the US, in Europe, in Japan, also in Korea, while for generic drugs, it is often China and India. And that basically tells me it is mainly a matter of cost. And we also see the perception of those concentration of API in China and India is very similar. So if you look into American newspapers, you will you'll often see almost the same statements, same headlines regarding API supply. So it's a cost issue.
That's right.
In case there will be re-onshoring to Europe or US, we will expect price increases for drug products. If decision is that to re-onshore again, that's what you're saying as well. Because costs will go up, so that means this will be also translated into higher prices. Okay. How do you see, because as I said, when I introduced your speech, David, there's a lot of discussion on re-onshoring of API production to Europe and or US. How would you see this? Where should or will this be most probably happen? Will it be on country level, on regional level, or on global level?
I think it's important to recognize that in most cases, API sites are multi-country, multi-region sites. So for example, paracetamol, one of the key drugs in the world, we have just 6 supply sites, API production sites all over the world. So if we discuss reshoring, it must be a discussion that is done at European level or WHO level, and also that confirms we need organizations such as WHO to trigger such discussion. If we talk about reshoring, I think we also have discussions around other measures. National drug reserve is one thing that is discussed at country level. Netherlands, for example, have just announced that they will establish such a national drug reserve. And another discussion is probably ongoing around the price level, especially when it comes to generics.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Will there be, do you expect that there will be maybe even some kind of API hubs? Because that was also in your speech, David, that you have to revisit also your inventory holding throughout your network. Will you expect there will be a European API hub storing huge amount of API in Europe?
Are you asking me?
Yes, sorry.
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. Just wanted to not done. I'm not sure if it will be done especially when it comes to API, if it's done at the European level. I'm pretty sure we will see inventory adjustments, risk inventory adjustments in all global pharmaceutical supply chains. I'm not so sure if this is something that will be resolved at European level just due to the complexity. But certainly, some inventory adjustments will happen either at company level or at country level.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Could we somehow assess what could be the potential impact of that consolidation of inventory and or production facilities in Europe? Will this be a massive redesign or just a minor optimization, what we expect? Maybe that's to both of you, because China is impacted and also rest of the world.
I think, if Europe, have such kind of, hubs, to do the API inventory, that's gonna benefit, the India and the China, because it's not. I think it's not the problem of redesigning. It's actually you just emphasize, the traditional, supply chain from Asia.
I think if we talk about reshoring, we have to keep in mind it's not the location that matters, it's the centralization of drug production in one region. In this case, it's China, but we would see similar issues if, let's say, all API plants would be located in the US. If the US would fail due to a crisis, we would see similar shortages. So what we've seen is we should take a look at the portfolio of medicine that is relevant for the different countries. We should focus on the essential medicine and look at essential medicine that is quite critical in terms of supply, so number of available supply sources, and then assess, at least if you talk about national level, is reshoring an option? Is it more a national drug reserve, or maybe the prices for certain drugs that should be increased? But as said before, all those measures would likely increase healthcare costs directly or indirectly. That's something we need to keep in mind here, also in the political discussion.
Very true. Yeah. It was also a very important fact you mentioned, Ben, that 80% of the drug costs delivered to patients is covered by the public healthcare system. That's quite an impressive number. Maybe another question from the audience. Because David, you mentioned that, of course, fortunately, we did not see any major disruption or complete shortages of drug supply in Europe or in general on a global scale. So people could think, well, why not easily just do some re-optimization, do some fine-tuning of the processes, implement maybe some sophisticated artificial intelligence system to manage your supply chain in a more efficient way, and that's it. Is that enough? Maybe to you, David, again.
I think right now we should still wait, because I would expect that due to those shortages, we will see some bullwhip effect bouncing back. And let's say the crisis is certainly not over when it comes to the implications for global supply chains in pharmaceutical industries. That's one thing we need to emphasize. The crisis is not over. Although we all have the feeling everything is settled right now, I think that's not the case. So based on discussions with companies, they did great efforts to ensure a steady supply to the markets. So it was quite thin. If the disruptions would take longer, I'm not so sure if we would see no shortages. It's just a thing. And I think the key thing right now is probably now to critically assess how the supply chains are set up, to identify what are critical parts of supply chains, and then to assess whether it's necessary to think about dual sourcing, capacity flexibility, capacity buffers, or more inventory. And this should be done, of course, in a cost-efficient way.
Yeah, I like your answer. So again, a one-size-fits-all approach will not help. So just redesigning is definitely not enough in the current situation. A very dramatic change to reshoring all API supply or production to Europe or US will not help either. So definitely it has to be on many ways segmented. What to do. You have to have your inventory position throughout your chain, as illustrated in your graph, David, with the API supply, drug production, and primary and secondary packaging. So you really have to reassess your inventory holding throughout your chain, and then also not only inventory but also your production capabilities. And dual sourcing, backup sourcing is definitely one option in that overall game. Okay,
absolutely.
Makes sense. Okay, I'm just checking our time-wise. We're just finishing. I think we have to close this panel discussion. So thanks again to you both, Ben and David. Very fruitful discussions we had. So let's do the close-up of and wrap-up of this session. And so again, thank you to both of you. I was happy to host this, moderate this panel discussion with both of you. So coming to the wrap-up, so let me quickly summarize today's session with some key takeaways for you. So we learned from the speech of Ben, there will be massive investments to stimulate the Chinese economic in general, and also there will be heavy investments also in the biotech domestic industry in China. That's what we learned. This will impact the overall drug supply, of course. The current discussions in politics around an on-off decision of reshoring of API production is not the sole solution, definitely not, and this will not solve the issue. Also, that what we've learned is that, in particular from a cost perspective, this will not help. And if we would reshore all capabilities and capacities from China and India to back again to Europe or US, this will be a massive increase of cost on the production side, and also increase of the drug product prices. Dual backup sourcing of API products that we've seen also in the digital twin, when you had in your model, David, the two sources of API, definitely this will cover and dampen the disruption. This will be definitely one key pillar you have to consider when doing a redesign of your manufacturing and also distribution network. So definitely that's a pillar to be considered. And we mentioned also in the last webinar, and again we did today, resilient supply chains are very important, and most of the companies we see currently are not yet there for many reasons. So therefore, it's an utmost important task of basically all supply chain managers to tackle that topic, while orchestrating their entire enterprises, but not only within the walls of the enterprise, but also incorporating their partner ecosystem, be it on the supply side and be it also on the customer side. And also logistics service provider play a very important role in that to orchestrate those end-to-end value chains. So therefore, of course, Tenthpin can help to support in that area, and I highly recommend to reach out to us because we have a digital supply chain resilience readiness assessment. Within 10 days, you will have a result. You will have an assessment of your current setup of your supply chain, and also we provide you with a checklist and recommendations how to make your supply chains more robust and more agile, and being prepared for the next disruption. So it was a pleasure to host that webinar. So thanks again to Bin, and a good evening to you, Bin, in Beijing, and thanks to David. So in case you have further questions, reach out to me. So thank you again for participating. And
thank you.
Stay healthy, and see you next time, next webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.